But to put that into perspective, we already invest over $80 billion every single year. And we need much less than that report even finds, considering it was talking about global recovery rates, and we're only talking about US national ones. As the National Resource Defense Council reports in July 2019, the US only makes up 12% of global waste. This proves that if we keep a minute fraction of the investment we're currently putting into a recycling industry, we can achieve the benefits as outlined in the report almost 6 times as fast. But the beauty of this bill is we also give US corporations 2 full years to prepare a plan to be reviewed by the Environmental Protection Agency to show they can actually meet the standard and meet this requirement to reduce waste once and for all. But why is that so important? You increase water conservation. Waste 360 publication reports this May that a recent study found that with significant investment into the recycling industry, exactly what you create today, we reduce the average water usage of 30 million people by keeping more water waste-free and usable. And that is more relevant now than ever before. The UN reports in 2016 that by 2030, water demand will surpass water supply by 40%. Every single ounce of water we save now is all future generations, and maybe even our generation, have to live on. Our waste issues may not be a mile high, but they certainly must be solved for ourselves, our families, our country, and even our planet. Your vote is with the affirmative.
Thank you for that speech of 2 minutes and 59 seconds. We're now in line for 2 minutes of direct questioning composed of 4 30-second blocks. Any and all questioners, please rise. That first question goes to Senator Resnick.
Thank you.
Hi.
What's the official definition of source material?
Source material is anything a company may use to produce a good.
Is that your definition or the government's? Because the government's defines source material as uranium and thorium.
I'd assume we go with the legislative intent of this bill was with materials we can actually recycle, not some legal definition that provides a loophole.
Wouldn't we go, it's not a loophole, we're targeting uranium and thorium. That's the legal definition. We would follow that.
So if anything, you still get the benefits of recycling because that's at least something recycled.
Senator Rao.
Representative, where does most of the actual recycling happen?
In recycling firms, or we send it out to other countries to recycle themselves.
So in the United States, the majority of our recycling firms are actually just for sorting recycled materials. So we're mostly sending things abroad. How safe are these facilities?
I'm not sure, but we can definitely do
at all. Why are we putting other countries, poor civilians, at risk of much more great harms?
Because if countries have poor labor standards, that happens in either world. But at the very least, our environment can benefit.
But why don't we set up firms in the United States to have both?
Great, let's do that. That happens when you make the investment today.
Hi, Senator. Does this legislation have an enforcement mechanism?
No, but that's up to the courts of the United States.
So what happens to a company under this legislation if they don't follow through with the stewardship plan?
The judicial system of the United States will decide their punishment.
Okay, but there's no punishment in this bill, and there's no...
That's outlined in the Constitution. When you break a law, you go to court, and they decide the punishment. If there's no precedent to go off of, they decide the punishment themselves.
Along another line of questioning, what happens to what we recycle?
It's reused for future materials and future goods.
We have one more block of questioning remaining. Would anybody like to take that? Senator Rao.
How much of what we send to recycling plants in foreign countries actually do get recycled?
I'm not sure, but I'd argue you create more recycling firms under this bill because for the first time in history, you make a significant
How are we
investment.
creating recycling firms? We're just setting up plans to make companies recycle more.
And when 75% of their material has to be recycled, I'm sure there's at least going to be some growth in the recycling industry in the United States.
Recycled?
Because there's only so much other countries can take. At a point, we have to develop our own industry, and that's where this bill comes into play.
Thank you. Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as I was a speech in sponsorship, we're now in line for a speech in the negation. Any and all first negative speakers, please rise. Senator Lawrence, you have it unopposed, but before you get started, let me send my spreadsheet in the chat.
Of course.
To the chamber, please let me know if this works. It should be titled Yale Semi's Recency. Okay, excellent. Senator Lawrence, floor is all yours.
Hello, everybody. My name is Senator Lawrence, representing the Central Minnesota District, and it's an honor to be here today. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me, so if you could just indicate when you're ready, that'd be great. And actually, PO, I'm not able to see the judges, so if you could just let me know when they're ready.
Okay, cool. I know judges may have some bandwidth issues, so if you could just holler at me if you're not ready. Otherwise, in like 5 seconds or so, you should be good to go.
Okay, thank you. The United States and this Congress are infamous for their half-baked ideas and programs, and I fear that this legislation is simply recycling our old tricks. This legislation is as flimsy as the plastic we are attempting to recycle, for the reasons of a lack of enforcement and monitoring mechanism, and the fact that recycling harms the environment. I'd like you to stand with me in negation. But first, let's discuss the enforcement mechanism. And I discussed this with Representative Kay in questioning. But first, I'd like to discuss that while this bill states that certain companies must create stewardship programs to increase recycling, the bill includes no penalty if the company does not recycle. The legislation has simply no enforcement and also no way to know or force companies to comply. We also need to understand this bill doesn't state how governmental bodies will be charged with measuring recycling outputs and the monitoring of the accuracy of corporal reporting. And this is important because according to the National Review on February 4th of 2019, the stickiest problem with such a legislation is the problem of fact-checking and verifying truth. Imagine what it would mean for a big manufacturer like Coca-Cola, which produces a large amount of recyclable goods, with parts that are manufactured and imported from multiple countries. Some of these parts themselves are made up of parts and commodities from still other countries. Keeping track of all these recycling flows and avoiding constant disputes over accuracy of this data will be an accounting nightmare, which is the first reason why you negate. But second, I'd like to take a look at how recycling actually can harm the environment. And this may seem counterintuitive, but stay with me. Because while a stewardship program might get companies to recycle, it doesn't mean it will get them to reduce their environmental impact. And this is because recycling is contributing to environmental degradation in the status quo. Representative Rao touched on this in questioning, and I'd like to flush it out. According to the Columbia Climate School on March 13th of 2020, the U.S. diverts its recycled waste to Cambodia, Bangladesh, Ghana, Laos, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Senegal, countries with cheap labor and tax environmental rules. The U.S. still ships over 1 million metric tons a year of plastic waste abroad, often to countries already overwhelmed by it. Experts estimate that 20 to 70% of plastic intended for recycling overseas is unusable and ultimately discarded. One study found that the plastic waste exported to Southeast America resulted in contaminated water, crop death, respiratory illness due to toxic fumes from incineration, and even organized crime. Rather than encouraging companies to recycle more, we should instead, with legislation like this, be encouraging them to use sustainable, biodegradable products instead. Instead of recycling source materials, why not make company plans for end-of-life product recycling that will actually benefit our future? Understand, this legislation is incredibly flimsy and is riddled with holes. We need to be implementing policy in this chamber that will actually have longevous results, because we do not want to perpetuate the plastic and other types of source materials that the US government currently is. This legislation only perpetuates the problem. For this reason, you negate.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. We're now in line for 2 minutes of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Between those standing, that will first go to Senator Wu.
Hi, Senator. So under today's legislation, does the EPA need to confirm with the stewardship plan for it to go forward?
Certainly, but the EPA is currently incredibly underfunded.
Okay, great. So your worst case scenario is nothing effective happens, correct?
No, what I'm saying the worst case scenario is we send hundreds of millions of tons over to countries that can't handle it.
Okay, doesn't that happen in the status quo already?
Certainly, but we're promoting decades of future recycling that's going to perpetuate the problem. We need to be promoting biodegradable materials instead.
Senator
Okay, great.
Ilakwa.
Thank you. By making more domestic companies recycle, doesn't that incentivize the creation of a domestic recycling program?
In theory, but is there anything in this legislation that'll ensure that happens?
Well, today's piece of legislation forces more domestic companies to recycle, so therefore they're incentivized to have more recycling programs. And
in theory, but these companies aren't the ones
recycling
making the recycling problems, the recycling centers, I mean. That would be the responsibility of the government, not these companies.
But these companies now are being forced to recycle. So if it's less expensive to keep it within the US than send it overseas, that's an option that they're going to choose, correct?
You can't ensure that it would be less expensive.
Senator Kanta.
Hi, do we know that plastic being sent overseas is being wasted? Like not
Yes.
being recycled?
My study
Great.
said
If
20
we-
to 70% is not even usable.
If we know that, then doesn't that mean that companies aren't meeting that 75% threshold?
I'm not saying they are in the status quo. I'm saying that this legislation isn't the way to
So
go.
if they're not meeting that threshold, why can't we enact penalties against them?
What I'm stating is there's nothing in this legislation that says it will
Okay,
occur.
so if we pass a law,
And that's not even the major issue. The major issue is making sure that they
if
follow
we
it all.
pass a law and somebody breaks it, what do the courts do?
Senator Konda.
Hey, Representative, I think that we both want biodegradables to become more prevalent in this country. What's stopping us from simultaneously developing recycling and biodegradables?
Because you're going to have a really hard time getting companies to do both. They don't want to do anything more
Why?
expensive.
Why
than
don't
you can't
we can
win.
just pass 2 bills, right?
Because companies do not want to do this. It's incredibly expensive for them to shift.
Yeah,
and
they
trying
don't want to
promote
do it,
voting
which
time
is
isn't going to fly.
right. They don't want to do it, obviously. So that's why we pass bills and force them to do it, right?
Thank you. Questioning
Exactly,
time
but
has
this won't
elapsed.
force them to do anything.
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Senator Lawrence, I believe, cut out during those last few questioning blocks very briefly. In the future, if that ever happens, I'm just going to pause time and then wait for that lag to catch up. But overall, it was just a couple seconds, so it's okay. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation, we're now in line for a speech in affirmation. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Senator Ilakwa.
Thank you. That's Senator Ilakwa, spelled ILACQUA for my judges, speaking for the first time today. Likewise, my screen is black, so if you are not ready, just feel free to let me know verbally. Otherwise, I'll assume that everyone is ready for me to begin. Okay, excellent, excellent, wonderful, perfect. Okay, let's get started. Since the Industrial Revolution, the United States has continually prided itself on its industrial might. However, when it comes to the 21st century, it's time this Congress realizes that that industrial might is creating an unsustainable environment for millions of Americans. At the end of the day, let's see the light at the end of the tunnel. Pass my legislation to support and strengthen domestic recycling programs and supply chains. Now, Senator Lawrence starts out today's debate being concerned that we're going to be shipping a whole bunch of recycling overseas, and either A, that isn't going to get recycled, or B, it's going to have negative environmental concerns. I would argue that those countries aren't even accepting our recycling now in the first place, because as the Solid Waste Association of North America explains on September 10th of 2019, after China adopted its national sword policy, setting stricter standards for the purity of recycling, it has resulted in about a 50% reduction in the revenue received from the sales of recyclables through curbside recycling. That in turn translated a reduction of over $400 million per year in profits for US cities, meaning that now millions of our curbside recycling programs are in shambles. What does that look like? As Waste Dive, a waste analysis firm, confirms, in November of 15th of 2019, they have indicated that approximately 60 curbside recycling programs have been canceled across the US, with even more drop-off sites and closures due to material limitations from foreign countries beginning to restrict the influx of US recycling there. Understand that passing today's piece of legislation fundamentally changes that, because the stewardship plan requires companies to recycle at least up to 75% of their goods. When foreign countries aren't an option, they're going to be in turn incentivized to produce and protect their own recycling initiatives within the US, meaning that now we have a complete supply chain from recycling sorting to recycling and reuse. But why is that so important? Principally, it forces producers to now be more efficient with the materials that they put into their products. Because as Time magazine explains on February 26, 2020, once producers have to pay for the cost of recycling, they'll start to make products more easily recyclable, meaning that at the end of the day, we're going to be seeing more recycling taking place in the United States of America. But that's not all, because as the American Marketing Association furthers, on May 16th, 2019, people recycle more when they know what their recyclable waste becomes. That means that when US companies now reuse and reintegrate the aluminum, plastic, and glass that they collect from consumed products, consumers will now want to recycle more because they're seeing the products that these raw materials are being made into. Senator Lawrence, the EPA is tasked with the enforcement of legislation. They're going to be seeing that our recycling is going to the correct places. At the end of the day, don't let industrial hums override the voices of Americans. Pass this legislation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 12 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Give one a second. Between those standing, that will first go to Senator Resnick.
Thank you. If current recycling institutions are so poor like you frame, why does it matter if corporate companies make their products more recyclable? Won't it all still end up in the trash?
Okay, so today's piece of legislation incentivizes companies to create their own recycling transformation program. So they essentially
that's private,
convert those used bottles into new finished products.
But do people, like the public, generally use private companies' institutions? No, right?
No, well, they use companies' goods, but they're going to be incentivized to recycle more because now they see that the bottle that they use is going to be made into a new bottle.
Senator Lauren.
Themselves.
How capable is the EPA of enforcing this legislation?
I would say it's pretty capable. President Biden has made many steps to reform the agency.
Along the same line of questioning, how difficult would it be to enforce a legislation that has plastic materials coming and manufacturing from across the globe?
I would say it's really not that difficult because it's publicly traded companies in the U.S., meaning that these are primarily going to be companies that are based in the U.S. So in turn, we're going to have a lot of oversight, and a lot of them already have sustainability initiatives. A lot of them have sustainability
Questioning
initiatives.
time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech, Chair, thanks you. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, we're now in line for a speech in the negation. Any and all negative speakers, please rise. That'll go to Senator Rao, unopposed.
I think the chair, that's Rao spelled R-A-O, like it is on my placard and on my screen. I know my PO is always ready, and I'm assuming that my judges will be ready as well. As long as they don't scream at me, I will begin in the next 5 seconds. When President Nixon founded the EPA in 1970, the EPA started with 3 vision statements: cleanliness, health, and protection. Now, to test the validity of this legislation, we will go one by one through these visions statements and see why this legislation fails all 3. 1, on cleanliness. This legislation will let companies create plans to recycle and pat themselves on the back for bettering the environment, except that doesn't actually happen. The US would be more likely to send their recyclable waste abroad to other countries, which is often more detrimental to the environment. Now, Senator Alakwa, you're telling us that we aren't actually sending recycling abroad because of Chinese policy, but our curbside recycling programs isn't just limited to China. In fact, The Guardian in 2019 tells us that even though domestic plants collect source material waste from domestic companies, they sort materials and auction it to international companies in Southeast Asia, like Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So when Representative Kantamneni tells us that recycling is feasible, he's categorically false. In fact, the Rochester Institute of Technology in 2020 says that last year, the equivalent of 168,000 shipping containers of American plastic recycling was exported from the US to developing countries that mismanaged more than 70% of their own plastic waste. Now, I want to separate myself from Senator Lawrence and say that I think that recycling does work, but I don't think that our status quo is equipped to handle it. Senator Alakwa, because of the cheaper nature of recycling abroad, there was no actual incentive for the government or companies to recycle domestically. But on health, the world's recyclable plastic is being shipped to Asia, where it is illegally dumped, buried, or burned in the country with the lightest regulations. The Guardian in 2019 says that when they're sent to third world countries, mismanaged waste kills up to 1 million people every year. This hazardous work is not only because of the pollution to which people are exposed to, but because of the risk of physical injury because of poorly managed dumps. Now, Senator Resnick already told you in questioning source material can contain harmful molecules like uranium and thorium. And Representative Kantemnani, if your goal is keeping water safe, it doesn't actually happen under this legislation. Once in a landfill, these toxic materials seep into the environment, contaminating land, water, and air. In addition, these devices are often dismantled with primitive conditions. Those who work at these sites suffer frequent bouts of illnesses and sometimes even death. Third, on protection. I think it's sick that the affirmation wants to pass an absurd bill and destroy the lives of not just our constituents, but every single person in these foreign countries who work in these recycling plants. Even though Congress has idealistic promises to recycle the source material, all we do is subjugate even more people in developing nations to certain death. Our lack of infrastructure shouldn't be the reason why we kill millions of people each year. Negate.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes exactly. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Senator Gupta, I can't see your camera for some reason, so if you're interested in questioning at any point, just use the raise hand function.
I've been raising my placard. Can you not see me right now?
You're good now, but during that speech, I just noticed that your camera had flipped off or something. Okay, cool. I'll just call one more time. Any and all questioners. Between those standing, it goes to Senator Zhang.
Hi, Senator. Great speech. So, if foreign countries are really mismanaging so much plastic waste, don't you think that would make those companies do the recycling domestically so that they can meet the 75% requirement?
No, because this requirement doesn't mean that 75% of the material actually has to be recycled. They have to send it to recycling because the companies themselves aren't actually.
But it has to increase the recycling of source material up to 75%.
So the companies themselves aren't doing the recycling, and therefore, when they send it to recycling plants, they'll all be recycled.
EPA finds out that 75% is not.
Senator Ilaqua.
Okay, Senator Conta told you that we're recycling something like 10% of goods in the status quo. Under today's legislation, we're increasing that to 75%. How can we afford to export all of our recycling to East Asian countries when they're already struggling now?
Because we can't really afford to keep it in the United States to begin with. It's so much cheaper to do it abroad.
Okay, but once they're becoming totally overwhelmed that we start to realize that, doesn't that incentivize us to create domestic recycling programs instead of sending it abroad?
These companies are profit-driven, not morally driven.
How are they able to send it abroad when it's like massively overwhelmed? That's just unfeasible.
Thank you. Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute.
I think the chair.
Chair thanks you. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation, we're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Between those standing, that will go to Senator Wu.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Wu speaking for the first time this session. Judges, please do note that my name starts with a J. It should be Jonathan. I know that if you do try and go off of school, tab room might not exactly display the entire name. And unfortunately, Senator Wu and I, or other Senator Wu and I, do have the same school name, relatively similar, at least. If I hear nothing from you guys, I assume that you guys are ready. Hearing nothing, I assume that you all are. When my grandfather was in high school, plastic bottles weren't a thing. When he bought a Coke, it would come in a glass bottle that he could return for a nickel, and the bottle would get reused. 70 years ago, this country had a system that produced nearly zero waste. Sometime between then and now, something went awry as heaps of synthetic waste stack up, and our landfills have turned into a leviathan liability, which threaten both our landscape and our livelihoods. It's because this legislation recycles an idea from the past to create a solution for the future I am proud to pass. I want to recharacterize recycling for everyone in this round. As Business Insider on September 18th, 2021 explains, as local governments considered banning single-use plastics, a council of plastic-producing companies, including Chevron and Exxon, spent millions of dollars to implement recycling programs across the US in the past few decades. Their goal was to push the blame of waste onto consumers. But how does today's legislation change that? Because when you pass today's legislation, you now put the responsibility on top of these companies through Section A. You now make sure that they are liable to clean up their own waste. As Dennis Hartman of the Houston Chronicle explains, there's a reason why these companies are actually going to comply. Because many companies actually end up saving money with stewardship plans by reducing manufacturing costs. This is because now they have an incentive to get rid of plastics outside of just money. The government is mandating it, and they are at risk of being sued by the EPA alongside the government. But what's the actual impact of this? A 2016 EPA report found that reducing waste by just 5% would eliminate over 10.4 million tons of annual emissions. But the entire negation comes up with this argument saying that today's legislation, in effect, changes nothing. This is championed by Senator Lawrence. The problem is that her advocacy states that today's legislation makes no change, meaning that if we pass or fail today's legislation, there is no harm, but when we pass, we do have the opportunity to receive some benefits under what I've explained alongside Senator Contamani and Alakwa. But then Senator Rao builds on this, explaining that all of these goods are sent abroad. The problem is that the Frontier Group on February 12th, 2018 explains that the majority of materials discarded by homes and businesses in the US are ultimately dumped into landfills or burned in incinerators. In layman's terms, whether you pass or fail, under Senator Rao's advocacy, you still change nothing whatsoever. Today's legislation is about probability mechanisms. The NEG argues that the probability mechanism is extremely high that there's no change. The problem is that the impact here is a net zero. Under the affirmative advocacy, you have a probability, a small chance that you can make real change. At the end of the day, the net benefit of today's legislation is a clear positive. Pass.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 6 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Senator Rao.
Hi, Representative. So when we ask companies to recycle more, they'll send more recycling goods abroad, right?
Not necessarily.
Well, let's say that they do because it's cheaper to recycle abroad, right?
Sure. It's
What
also cheaper
happens
to
if-
dispose waste abroad.
When an increase of recycling materials gets sent abroad, then more people in those countries are exposed to more waste, right?
So Senator Alakwa already told you that these countries are shutting down their waste programs acceptance from the United
What about
States.
all of the other countries like Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam? Are these people's lives
At
not
its
in
highest
harm?
ground, they already are at capacity.
Thank you. We have one more block of questioning. Would anybody like to take that? Senator Lawrence.
So in your speech, you seem to be under the impression that recycling products abroad is better than simply wasting them abroad. But don't they end up in the same place
today's
either way?
legislation provides an incentive for companies to not even produce the waste in the first place because they would have that stewardship program.
Again, so the stewardship program incentivizes recycling, correct?
It incentivizes them to eliminate waste.
And it'll still end up in the same place, though, right?
Okay, so they
Recycling's never
produce
going-
zero waste, yet end up having to send a bunch of it abroad. I don't think that we can make
Questioning
materials
time has
out of
elapsed.
nowhere.
Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, we're now in line for a speech in the negation. Any and all negative speakers, please rise. Senator Resnick, unopposed.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. That's Senator Resnick speaking for the first time in this session. I can't see anyone, so if the PO could give me an audible indication that all of my judges are ready, that'd be great.
Looks like you're good to go.
Perfect. Thank you. When someone wants to describe something as trivial or without purpose, they call it splitting hairs. When someone wants to access an energy source, they call it splitting atoms. It seems that as our subjects get smaller and smaller, their consequences get larger and larger. On either side of the aisle today, there should be no question as to whether nuclear energy is destructive. But the affirmation's recycling plan is beyond just splitting hairs. It fractures the future of our free market. It was a lot of F's, but I've got one more. Fail this legislation. I want to do one thing at the beginning of my speech. Give you some context. Right off the bat, I want you to remember back to Senator Contameni's speech where he told you that source material was plastic. I questioned him on it and he rebuked with legislative intent. Two things there. Number one, he didn't write the piece of legislation. He doesn't have legislative intent. Number two, every single legal institution disagrees with him. Cornell Law, the US NRC, and Oxford all substantiate that source material is uranium and thorium, or the building blocks for nuclear energy. It's scary that the entirety of my side completely ignored his fallacy, but it's a definitive truth that the affirmation has categorically failed to support nuclear recycling. The neg should win right off that. But I'll take them at their highest ground. I'll engage with their mischaracterizations because I agree with the majority of their logic separate from that misdefinition. We agree on the logic that right now, current production practices are environmentally harmful and costly to users. But it's because those are current harms relevant to current businesses and current costs that the affirmation solvency here is non-unique. The truth here is that corporate America is already moving towards more sustainable manufacturing. Harvard Business Review explains in 2019 that more recently, American production facilities have recognized that there's a cost associated with their waste, and now they're actively investing in public recycling programs to try and increase the efficiency of their products and get source materials at a lower cost. That's where the affirmation misconstrued our status quo, in that the cost that they tell you about is already incentivizing the improvement within a system, but it's the public system. No wonder the AF skated past this reality because the impact wins the round. Realize when you pass this bill, you increase recycling initiatives, but not the public ones that I tell you about or Senator Alakwa told you about are so flawed. Instead, it's the private institutions that receive more funding because we're asking these mega companies to invest in their own recycling plans, not the public ones they currently invest in. If you honestly want to improve on net the most amount of recycling procedure, it makes more sense to maintain the status quo, allow for the continued investment into public institutions, protect the people on top of that, rather than just trying to funnel all the money back into corporate interest. There is absolutely no reason to pass this bill, especially when not even the AF knows what they're talking about.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 4 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. All right, between those standing, that will first go to Senator Conta.
Hi.
Hi, you say the status quo is good for recycling initiatives, right?
It's not perfect, I'm not saying that, but it's heading in a better trajectory.
How is less than 10% of waste being recycled even close to good?
Yeah, like I told you, it's not perfect in the status quo, but we see that there is investment going into the public institutions that is going to improve that number you talk about.
Don't we have impending deadlines with water scarcity and climate change that we need to expedite?
That there's a current crisis. Why is it better for private institutions to funnel all of their money into their personal practices? I don't understand how that's solved.
We're already pairing with public.
Hey, Representative. So why don't we just invest in private and public recycling at the same time?
There's finite money.
Well, not if the private investment is coming from private corporations.
Yeah, but you're asking for more money for the public sector. The reason I'm trying to explain to you is that money.
I'd say that
a
couple. I'd gladly trade in a couple $1 billion any day if it means saving our entire planet.
So would I, but that's so unlikely.
So if you would,
crisis for the past 10
so
years.
it's unlikely that we want to save the planet. I'm a little bit confused
It
here.
is. You've watched this Congress continue
Thank you.
to act.
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation, we're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Senator Conda.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Conda, just about how you see it on the screen. I speak at the leisure of all, so I'm going to give you guys about 5 seconds and I'll get
Point of inquiry.
Senator, I believe you're
am I muted?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me do that again. My name's Representative Conda. Are you guys all ready? Yes, no? Okay, great. Sorry about that. Sorry, let me. Okay, I'm ready now. Let's be honest for a second. The real Congress, the one on Capitol Hill, doesn't care about the climate. Most of them won't be here in 10 or 20 years. The fact is that we are the first generation to feel the effects of climate change, but the last generation who can do something about it. Respect that and pass today's legislation. First, you pass today's legislation to decrease the cost of municipal recycling. Senator Kanta explains to you that the cost of recycling in the status quo is way too high, and he's actually right, but he solely focuses on private sector recycling. Let me be the first to apply this debate to the public sector. Time magazine explains that cities in the status quo are being faced with a national annual loss of $400 million when it comes to operating recycling facilities. Many of them have stopped recycling altogether. But why do they face these challenges in the first place? One of the biggest challenges that makes costs so high is sorting materials by the different recycling parts. In the status quo, there's no effective way to separate the different types of waste, so thousands of tons of recyclables are destroyed because of a single errant contaminant, as small as a pizza box. But how does this bill specifically solve the problem of our lacking infrastructure? Senator Kanta puts it best, innovation. But let's take a deeper dive. I'll actually concede to the negations framing that Representative Lawrence tells us that companies will use municipal recycling in the status quo. However, if these private corporations use the systems placed in the status quo, they'll see huge backlog and inefficiency. Again, just like Representative Rao tells you. Here's where we diverge. Companies don't want to see this happen, so they make the process better and more cost efficient. We've seen the readiness already. The American Chemistry Council, which represents plastic manufacturers, says it expects the industry to spend $25 billion in public recycling R&D. The Department of Energy, for comparison, pledged a merely $14 million to the cause. Literal chump change. Clearly, we see an increase in investment and therefore innovation. But why is this innovation so important? It's because you finally promote recycling beyond companies. Stanford explains to us that new emerging technologies, such as infrared sorting, can solve problems with separation that cities have in the status quo. The caveat is that these new technologies need large-scale private investment to make them happen. Once that happens under this bill, cities and governments can readopt recycling as an integral part of their community. Representative Lawrence, Resnick, and Rao, you say that municipal systems are bad. I agree, which is why we should be doing everything in our power to increase investment towards them. In fact, Representative Lawrence and Rao, when we recycle materials in the United States and promote domestic recycling, we don't need to send them out to the other countries. So if that's what you're concerned on, vote on the affirmation. But let's quantify this and be the first in the round to do so. The EPA explains that 174 million tons of recyclable waste goes to municipal landfills in the status quo. Worst case, you still save 174 million tons of waste purely by solving municipal investment problems. That effect would be equivalent to taking 33.5 million cars off the road. The outweighs the negation simply on the probability of impact. Look, I don't want to save the environment. I want to create a world where the environment doesn't need saving. Pass.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any all questioners, please rise. Senator Resnick.
Thank you. We both agree. Public recycling institutions need funding. So how does incentivizing personal recycling plans continue that progress?
That's not what your side told me. Your side told me that private corporations will be using municipal factories. So that's what I'm going off of. The past two speakers told me that.
Just because my side said something doesn't mean that that's fact, right?
Okay, great. Let's take you at your highest ground. If they use private recycling, they're still recycling something. That's better than not recycling at all.
Removing funding from the public sector that we both care about.
Where in this legislation does it say we're removing public sector?
Because the money that's going to public institutions now has to be removed to go to the private one.
The private sector isn't funding the public industry.
Representative, I'm a little bit confused.
I am too.
If it's cheaper for companies to establish like domestic recycling, why aren't they doing that in the first place?
Because they have no incentive to, like.
So right now,
this legislation gives them the incentive.
You're telling me that right now it costs them money to send things abroad for recycling. Why aren't they saving money by doing it domestically in the first place? Is it because it doesn't actually?
Well, it's because there's no incentive. This legislation gives you the incentive because they're forced to recycle.
If it's cheaper to do it domestically.
Yeah, just look at Representative Wu's point. If they export all of their recyclables, then what are they going to use for their source material?
Thank you. Questioning time is elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, we're now in line for a speech in the negation. Any and all negative speakers, please rise. I'll call it one more time. Any and all negative speakers, please rise. Seeing none, the chair highly frowns upon a one-sided debate. But with that, we will have to move back to the affirmation. Are there any affirmative speakers at this time? Senator Gupta, you have the floor unopposed.
I thank the chair. For the judges and chambers reference, this is Senator Gupta, spelled Gupta. One more time, that's Gupta, Gupta. Pio, can you confirm that you can see and hear me? Because I know I've been having camera issues all day.
You're good right now.
All right, thank you. One more time, that's Gupta, and I'm going to assume my judges and Pio are ready unless told otherwise. In the landmark court case, Juliana v. United States, the youth rebelled against this very Congress to pass adequate environmental reform. And while it was inspiring to say the least, it speaks volumes on our ability to act together. Affirmed today because of the built-in incentive and the long-term impact. Representative Rao starts out this debate by telling us that recycling centers are the problem. We can split this up into two main issues. Number one, domestic recycling systems. Inside the US, that means it's under the control of the EPA. This chamber has the power to enact legislation that solves every single one of the problems with the lack of municipal recycling that was listed by Representative Rao for domestic recycling centers. But her second issue, recycling centers abroad. Representative Rao says that even though larger countries will be closed, smaller ones are still at risk. The AF wins on probability because there's no way that smaller countries are able to carry 75% of recyclable source material. Even if that same 10% is still carried out of the US, at the very least, that's not a net harm. It's just keeping the status quo. Representative Lawrence says that the EPA is underfunded as a reason to negate. This congressional chamber is the one who controls funding. So Representative Lawrence, if you want to increase the EPA's budget in the next fiscal year, I'll sit here and write the plan with you, because off of time frame, we have 2 years to increase the budget before the enactment of this legislation actually occurs. But that's not even the net benefit of today's legislation. It's the fact that you establish a relationship for further conservation. Let's look at historical precedent with Australia's environmental stewardship program, because the ANU Press in 2016 explains that after they enacted it, relationships forged with contracted land managers and developed with CSIRO were nurtured to foster further learning and trust. Why is it so important to establish good relationships? Well, The Hill in March of 2020 explains that it historically correlates with companies adhering to legislation and building a platform for fair legislation that's more likely to be complied with, meaning the magnitude of better relationships is an investment into the long term. But that's not the only incentive into the future. Representative Lawrence says that companies won't comply with incentives. Here's the thing, it's already in the status quo. There's an inherent economic benefit that's explained by the New York Times, telling us that when companies invest into the environment, they have increased productivity, increases in provisioning, regulating, and supporting ecosystem services. So Representative Rao asks a good question. Why is it that companies don't already do it? Because of the initial overhaul of the cost. And that's exactly what this bill accomplishes by forcing these companies to create stewardship material. That means they have a both short and long-term investment. Here's the thing. The companies we're targeting with this legislation are traditionally the ones who combat environmental legislation. Focus into the long term and make it so that this congressional chamber creates environmental impact, not teenagers filing court cases.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Senator Rao.
Hi, Representative. I agree that these smaller countries can't really handle the load that we're going to be sending them, but that's the point. Isn't it a net harm if the lives of these foreign recycling plant workers are at risk because of the load we're sending them?
No, it's not probable that it will happen because they won't even accept it. We've established
They have been accepting these massive loads in the status quo. What's to stop them?
Previous affirmation senators have already established that they're closing to that.
Senator Alakwa mentioned China. What about the other countries?
Those other countries aren't able to take 75% of recycling.
That's what I'm telling you. They're already doing that in the status quo.
They're
Senator
taking
Lawrence.
So you discuss in your speech companies and how they aren't doing recycling because of the initial costs. But how would this legislation actually overcome that barrier?
Because you literally force them to create stewardship programs that address the issue.
Exactly. But why does that mean that they're going to either create their own public recycling or overrun municipal current.
Because that's how the EPA works. It establishes rules and regulations, and those companies follow them.
I'm not even saying about procurement of the actual legislation, but why does this mean it's going to be domestic instead of international, as Representative Rao was telling you?
I addressed both issues.
Thank you. Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, we're now in line for a speech in the negation. Any and all negative speakers, please rise. Once more, any and all negative speakers, please rise. Okay. I'm going to go back to the affirmative. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Senator Zhang.
I take the chair that Senator Jake Zhang, spelled Z-E-N-G, speaking for the first time today on the affirmation of today's legislation. Since everybody's silent, I'm going to assume that everybody's ready. If you're not, just give me an indication that you are ready. Okay. This Congress has always prided itself in solving the nation's problems. Unfortunately, we've left one of the most pressing issues of our generation ignored: climate change. And even as it seems that the companies in our countries have given up on helping the environment in order to increase their profits, this Congress must take steps in a different direction towards a better future for our world. Affirm. Now, as one of the last speakers in today's debate, I'd like to first start by addressing some of the concerns of the negation. Senator Resnick points out that no one on the affirmation has actually defended the recycling of source material. So allow me to be the first. Frank Buncombe of Stanford University states on March 25th, 2018, that after recycling uranium and other nuclear fuel, the final waste product is less radioactive and will have to be stored for a smaller amount of time in the waste fuel that is immediately destined for disposal. And Senators Lawrence and Rao, you talk about the impacts of recycling on a few countries. And Senator Rao, you actually concede that foreign countries are mismanaging plastic waste. If they are, then it will be hard for companies to use these countries as recycling in order to meet their 75% recycling requirement, incentivizing them to recycle domestically rather than going to foreign nations. But even if your points stand, let me tell you about how not only about how even though your points say that this will cause disaster to a few countries, let me tell you about how not recycling can cause global devastation. Senator Wu already tells you that waste is dumped into landfills. Now let me expand on this. Because the second reason that you affirm today's legislation is that landfills piling up can devastate the environment through the release of methane gas. Kayla Vesserhalli of the University of Colorado Boulder states on April 15th of this year that as the organic mass in landfills decomposes, methane gas is released, which is 85 times more effective at absorbing the sun's heat than carbon dioxide, making it one of the most potent greenhouse gases and a huge contributor to climate change and global warming. And when we ignore greenhouse gas emissions, we exacerbate a continual problem, global warming, which has devastating effects. Alina Bradford and Stephanie Pappas write for Life Science on August 12th of 2017 that global warming causes extreme weather effects worldwide, the melting of the polar ice caps, and sea level rise, which causes flooding of coastal communities like my home state of Florida. In fact, Irina Ivanova of CBS News reports on February 22nd of this year that homeowners across the United States can collectively expect to pay out $20 billion for flood damage this year, around 4 times what Americans spent repairing flood damage in the 1980s, reflecting the impact of more erratic weather patterns driven by climate change. Climate change has been one of the most important, yes, one of the most ignored issues of our time. Now, senators, you have the choice to keep letting companies wreak havoc on our planet or the choice to act. Let's not let our devastating trend of ignorance continue past this legislation.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 5 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Between those standing, that first goes to Senator Resnick.
Thank you. If global warming is a current risk, right? It affects businesses today. Why do we need a piece of legislation to preempt some type of change?
I think that since this legislation is already on the floor, the best thing would happen is just to pass it.
But isn't there active progress already happening in the status quo?
Right, but this will help because some companies are just valuing their profits over actually recycling things.
Yes, but in the long term, these companies are going to have to shift regardless, right, in order to stay afloat.
Well, right now there's already continual problems, and I think we should solve them as soon as possible rather than delaying it further.
Senator Rao.
Hi, Representative. Are these companies liable for what happens to the goods after they sent it to be recycled?
Yes, because if 75% of their goods that they send to foreign countries aren't recycled, then they'll get punished.
No, but Representative, they just have to meet a quota for recycled material. They're not the ones actively recycling them.
No, it says that they have to increase the recycling up to 75%.
Yeah, but the companies themselves aren't doing the recycling, right?
Yeah, but they have to increase the recycling, meaning if the foreign countries are doing the recycling for them,
how is there an incentive for them to worry about what happens?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
How is there incentive for them to worry about what happens after?
Thank you. Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute.
Motion.
Senator Wu.
Barring any objections, I move to the question.
Is there a second to that motion? More importantly, are there any opposed? Senator Resnick, is that an objection? Okay. Seeing none, that motion does pass. That triggers the final appeal. So, Senator Kanta, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. As a reminder, time signals are 1 minute, 1:25, and then I'll let you finish a sentence at 1:30.
Great. I'm just going to give my judges a couple seconds, as always, and then just get started. Great. I'll get started then. I want to start by dealing with this Hail Mary Senator Resnick tries to make for the negative. Because even if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission defines source material as uranium and thorium, the EPA, the agency enforcing this bill, has a closest definition to this by defining it as the most common materials and durable goods. And even in the worst case scenario here, Senator Resnick gave you 0 harms of nuclear recycling. Compare that to the benefit Senator Zhang on the affirmative just gave you here. Your vote is clear. With that being said, I want to answer one central question in this debate. What will companies do with the material they need to recycle? This has been the negative's strongest advocacy down the bench, but it is still filled with fantasy and fallacy. Senator Rao and Lawrence tell you that companies will just recycle abroad. 3 responses. First off, as the negative conceded, and as Senator Lockwood told you, they cannot turn to China. National Public Radio reports in March of 2019 that 70% of the world's plastic goes to China. So this effect is marginal at best, considering the blunt of the burden is avoided. But secondly, why in the world will the EPA approve this plan? Realize they're regulating and reviewing every single one of these ordeals. We have the power to step in. And thirdly, Senator Kanda and Alakwa proved to you that you domesticate the industry, and Senator Gupta further proved to you that these countries can't even handle the scale of recycling. And so long as some waste is prevented, that is water for future generations. That is air not filled with smoke and smog. That is a future worth fighting for. That is an affirmative victory.
Thank you for that final appeal of 1 minute and 28 seconds. This will have no questioning. We'll move straight to voting. How we'll do this is, if you wish to pass this legislation, please raise your hand or your placard, and then don't put it down until I say your last name. All those wishing to pass. I count 1, Zhang, 2, Kanda, 3, Ilakwa, 4, Gupta, 5, Kanta, and 6, Wu. All those wishing to fail this legislation, please raise a hand or a placard. Here I count 1, Resnick, 2, Lawrence, and 3, Rao. Are there any abstentions? I believe there should be none. Okay, so on a vote of 6 to 3 to 0, this resolution does pass. My congratulations to the sponsor.
Motion.
This time.
Motion.
Senator Kanda.
I believe we have the time for a 10-minute recess.
Are there any seconds to that motion? Any opposed? Seeing none, we're now in line for a 10-minute recess. Please be back at 10:43 a.m.
Senator Z,
Did Representative Conte
split?
Sorry. Yes, I can lead that. Is everybody still here? If you're, still at your computer, can hear my voice. If you could come back, we want to take a split on the second bill. For those of you that are here, the next legislation that we're in line to debate is prescribed fires. Oh, this with an AF. Please raise a hand or a placard. I count 1, 2, 3. Senator Resnick, that's not a hand.
I have both, so I can go after.
Okay, so I count 3. And then Lawrence, that makes 4, I think. All those with a neg speech, please raise a hand or a placard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, that's fine.
Wait,
Yeah,
can I
that's
ask, are any of you guys sponsoring? Because
Yes, I would like to.
okay, perfect. Cool.
Okay, cool. I'll see you guys in 10. For the judges, I'll be here for the entire recess. If you need me, just give me a shout. Hi, everyone. We have just over a minute left in this recess. So if everybody would like to start heading back and turning on their cameras to indicate that they're ready to go and resume debate, that would be awesome. With that, our 10-minute recess has elapsed. So at 10:43 a.m. Central Standard Time, I call this session back into order. It looks like all of our judges are here. Just make sure in the chat. Okay, we look good. All competitors good to go as well. All right, so let's resume. We left off on a debate about prescribed fires. For the judges, that is Bill Semifinals C. Are there any authors present? Are there any sponsors? Senator Ilaqua, unopposed.
Thank you. That's Senator Ilaqua, spelled ILACQUA for my judges, speaking for the second time today. If you are not ready, please feel free to give me an indication in any way, shape, or form, and I will not begin. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and start. All right, excellent, excellent. Wonderful. Just this past week, my hometown of Houston was impacted by Hurricane Nicholas, dousing 15 inches of rain across our metropolitan area. And it's because while I was sitting in my home without power, I got to thinking about the millions of constituents across the United States that had to deal with opposite, the massive wildfires that continue to rage through America's forest. I finally realized today's bill needed to be passed. Principally, pass my bill, a bill to ban prescribed fires to improve environmental conditions across the United States. First, let's outline the problem and the status quo and what exactly prescribed burns are, as the Coalition of Prescribed Fires Councils quantifies in their 2020 annual report. In 2019, almost 10 million acres of forests were treated with prescribed fires, an increase of 28% compared to 2011. As the National Park Service explains, on March 19, 2020, prescribed fires often include dousing small grasses that lay on the forest floor, so that way, in the event that a wildfire should emerge, it doesn't burn as hot because of the fact that the main fuel and main kindling for that fire has now been burnt up beforehand. But let's see why prescribed fires even emerged in the first place. As the MIT Technology Review explains, on September 17, 2020, due to a variety of cost-cutting measures facing firefighting techniques, many prescribed burns became the norm, simply because they cost around $200 per acre to induce, as opposed to thinning, which involves cutting out this kindling, which is almost $1,000. Understand, though, that those prescribed burns come with a variety of environmental harms. But how does my piece of legislation change this issue? Section 1 says that no prescribed burns will be taking place in the United States, and then only fire suppression policies will be put in place. And Section 3 tasks the U.S. Department of Agriculture Service with enforcement of today's piece of legislation. What does that mean for our American constituents across wildfire-prone areas? First, it means that their air becomes cleaner, because as Ran Huang of the Georgia Institute of Technology explains, on June 29, 2019, around 40% of Americans live in areas which are infected by wildland fires with a moderate or high contribution of particulate matter in the air. Specifically, though, U.S. prescribed burning contributes to about 30% of those emissions, while opposed to wildfires contributing to only 3%, meaning that by passing this legislation, you remove one of the largest causes of wildland pollutants in the status quo. What does that mean for millions of Americans' healths? as the Sadia Afrin of the North Carolina State University explains, on June 26, 2021, smoke-related health incidence rates are over 3 times larger than the US average in spatial clusters of intense burning and prescribed burning activity, and over 40% larger in spatial clusters of high vulnerability. Pass my legislation for the millions of Americans who can't choke on the air they're breathing. When our lowest income constituents continue to bear the brunt of the lack of progress in this country, that's something I can no
Thank you
longer.
for that speech of 3 minutes and 15 seconds. We're now in line for 2 minutes of direct questioning composed of 4 30-second blocks. Any and all questioners, please rise. Between those standing, that first goes to Senator Gupta.
Hi, Representative. So has the Forest Service ever stopped controlled fires before?
So sometimes they get out of control, but generally they try to keep them contained.
Yeah, so actually before they completely stopped it, and when that happened, do you know if they saw a benefit to the ecosystem or harm?
So I would say that wildfires probably burn hotter, but we also reduce environmental pollutants, which in the long term are going to contribute more to climate change, which means that we have more dangerous fires.
Okay, but the reason that it was stopped and that this legislation was stopped originally was because it actually hurt the environment. So why should we
Senator
make
Wu.
that mistake again?
Hi, Senator Alakwa. So right now you're talking about how experts in the status quo are engaging in these prescribed fires, correct?
Yeah.
Great. So these experts believe that the net benefits of prescribed fires are significantly better than the net harms. Why should I buy you and your argument over the experts?
So generally, prescribed burning emerged as a cost-cutting measure because previously teams had to thin pieces of landscape, which was more expensive, as opposed to just burning through it, which is more risky.
Okay, does today's legislation increase funding?
Senator Zhang.
Hi, Senator. Great speech. So isn't it possible for us to schedule prescribed burns at a time where they don't pose a risk to the public and in areas that are near any public citizens so that it poses less of a harm?
So I would say that if people live in an area that is prone to fires, you're still going to have prescribed burns happening there. We can't just move people out of their homes to have a prescribed burn and then pull them back a week later.
Okay, yeah, but can we also set a schedule for a time when the weather is right so that it doesn't spread as much?
Yeah, that's generally what we do, but the problem is that no matter what, emissions increase because you're still burning.
Senator Conda.
Hey, Representative. So in wildfire-prone areas, such as California, those things are pretty much inevitable on a year-round basis, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's better? We choose what areas get burned, or we just allow Mother Nature to decide?
Okay, so I would argue that no matter what, Mother Nature is going to get worse in the long term because with prescribed burns, we're polluting more into the air.
Right. But if wildfires happen anyways, then pollution happens anyways as well. So why don't we just control which areas get burned so we don't affect residential
Generally,
areas?
prescribed burns tend to get out of control, so therefore, we can't.
Thank you.
But there's less probability.
Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was our sponsorship speech, we're now in line for our first negation speech. Any and all negative speakers, please rise. That goes to Senator Conta off of recency.
Everyone, second and a half time today. That's Kanta, K-A-N-T-A, or Cantaneni, K-A-N-T-A-M-N-E-N-I. Whichever way you want to shorten it, that's totally fine with me. I'm just going to give my judges a couple seconds and then get started. Great, I'm just going to get started then. America is often trapped between two options to forge its future. Actually, let me correct that. America traps itself with two options to forge its future. This debate is not or never was about whether prescribed fire is good or bad, because there is so much more at play. First off, let's understand that there's a lot of rules and regulations that control prescribed fires. The Journal of Forestry explains in July 2020 that prescribed fires predominantly happen in the American Southeast. And every single one of these states has A, liabilities for the perpetrators of these fires, B, layers upon layers of regulations for timing and safety in each state, and C, more and more rules added as time goes on. So it's not like Joe Schmo can just decide to burn a few acres of your local forest down. It's an incredibly intricate and bureaucratic process regulated by individual states. That's why I'm asking you to negate. This bill cuts out the benefits that remain. Let's understand that controlled fires are only harmful when they get out of control. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations Archives, accessed this month, explained that all the potential harms of prescribed fires to human health only happen with repeated exposure. But that doesn't happen when states are restricted with regulation. That explicitly refutes Senator Alakwa because regulation is there, and if anything, more is being added on. And also, the potential harms to wildlife can all be avoided with proper timing and burning technique, once again solved through state safety regulation. And all the harms of pollution only happen with either A, prescribed fires happening very often, or B, inadequate safety measures. But yet again, both of those don't happen when states are restricted with regulations. But I'm going to prove to you that even with limited use, even with restricted access, you can still maintain all the benefits of prescribed fires. The Noble Research Institute reports in March of 2017 that depending on what type of land you're dealing with, you only need to use prescribed fires anywhere from once in every 3 years to once in every 15 years. Meaning, we can get all the benefits of controlled and prescribed fires with none of the harms that come with it that Senator Alakwa would tell you about. And considering that Senator Alakwa himself admits that firefighters were forced to cut costs, there is almost no alternative to prescribed fires, as my side has showed you in cross-examination. But why is that so important? You improve air quality, protecting ecosystems. U.S. Forest Service resources accessed this month outline there are 7 separate ways prescribed fires improve the health, durability, growth, and prosperity of ecosystems. And as the Journal of Science and Technology explained in July 2021, it is critical. Each and every single one of these avenues prevent further air pollution. The negative is the side that gets the benefits of air quality Senator Alakwa champions. Because even if you take him at his highest ground, where there is a short-term loss, in the long term, states have shown they're becoming more and more restrictive with regulation, meaning you get all the benefits of safety and none of the harms that draw us back. Life is being strangled out the lungs of innocent Americans, but you have a choice to take action. You have a choice to better our future. The negative is that choice.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 2 seconds. We're now in line for 2 minutes of direct questioning composed of 4 30-second blocks. Any and all questioners, please rise. Senator Alakwa.
What happens when there is regulation and a fire gets out of control?
Then we can contact the firefighters. And I'm going to tell you here, the experts agree that prescribed fires are much better considering they also prevent further wildfires.
Sure, but then also we are held liable for that fire getting out of control in the first place, meaning that we then have to pay for those liabilities that we incur. Doesn't that then in the long term reduce the amount of expenditure we can provide towards like fighting fires?
So when someone is held liable, that incentivizes them to ensure safety because they don't want to pay all that cost that comes with liabilities. So that makes us more accountable. And
how can we control adverse atmospheric conditions?
Senator Rao.
Prescribed fire.
Hi, Representative. Do you prescribe? You're talking about all these regulations that come along with prescribed fires. Do prescribed fires require a lot of people on site at times?
It depends on the regulation and it depends on which state you're in. Okay,
That's
great.
Point of controlling for the fires. Having that many people near a fire, is that safe or dangerous? It's dangerous, right?
What's even less dangerous is wildfires that kill much more innocent people.
But wildfires are a lot more isolated than these prescribed fires. Prescribed fires happen a lot more often near residential areas, right?
But at the very least, I will take controlled fires caused by humans that we can control compared to Mother Nature's prescribed fires. That
we have 1 minute left of questioning composed of 2 more blocks. Senator Lawrence.
So a lot of the arguments in your debate rely on the fact that prescribed fires can help benefit wildfires. Is that correct?
That is one of the benefits, but they also benefit the growth of ecosystems, which is independent of preventing wildfires.
So do prescribed fires actually have the benefit of stopping wildfires, or are there other causes in play?
That is definitely one of the major causes that prevents wildfires. And even if the affirmative proves to you that isn't true, I'd argue there's still 7 other avenues you create that benefit the air pollution that the air quality that we all breathe.
Senator Rao.
Hi, Representative. So Senator Alakwa brought up something called thinning, and the reason that we switched to prescribed fires was because thinning is expensive. But shouldn't we value our air pollution and all of that stuff, like you're saying, over like the cost of something? Wouldn't thinning be better than prescribed fires?
So the issue is firefighters are seeing their budgets cuts. So that's why they're moving to cheaper options. So it's not a world in which So we just have to take whatever options we have because it's not a world where they have
the
luxury.
power of the purse. Why don't we fund them instead of allowing?
We don't fund local firefighter departments,
Well,
but
we
we
can fund the state governments. We can like give them money to fund their fire.
at best we can give them
Thank
grants.
you.
We don't know what they'll
Questioning
do
time
with
has
that.
elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was our first negation speech, we're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Oh, Senator Conda, you don't want that speech? Got it. Okay.
Sorry, I thought you called.
Okay, I'll call one more time. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Okay.
Motion?
Yeah, state that motion.
I move for a quick 1-minute in-house recess.
Are there any seconds to that motion? Any opposed? Seeing none, we'll have a 1-minute in-house recess. We are only on the first, or like the beginning of the second cycle of this debate. So I would encourage the chamber to sort of discuss and see who wants to give this next speech.
Yeah.
I'm still writing my speech right now. I just literally needed one more cycle and I was going to go. But...
Same. I also have an AF, but I'm just not quite ready yet. I can be, I guess. If no one else is willing to, I can scrape together a speech for right now.
Okay. So who else has a negation prepared? So just we can gauge that. I mean, sorry, affirmation.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to ask?
So Representative Rao and Representative Lawrence. What about? Okay, so you two are the only AFs left.
Our split was five. It was four AFs,
4-5. Yeah, 4-5.
So that makes sense.
Oh, okay.
Wait,
Okay.
no, it doesn't. We just had one AF, and then we have two.
So there's only three.
3-6
Oh,
for some reason. So somebody who was supposed to do it.
Who was the other
It's not
one?
me then.
Aren't there four? Because
There's 9 people in this round, and
Okay.
Senator
our recess
Sanger
has
Radcliffe
elapsed.
would-
Our recess has elapsed. So barring any motions, we're going to proceed with debate. I'm going to call again for the affirmative speech. Are there any affirmative speakers? Senator Lawrence.
Hello, everybody. I'm once again Senator Lawrence, speaking much earlier than planned on the affirmation of this legislation for the second time this legislative session. As always, I'm at the leisure of those above me, but I believe you've all indicated you're ready, so I will begin unless told otherwise. I know today wildfires are a heating topic. And I also agree with the negation that this legislation is something that we need to seriously discuss today. But I'd also like to contend its many merits. And I'll be doing so today by assessing the arguments made so far in the negation and the affirmation and assessing why the affirmation wins out thus far. So first, I'd like to bring up the discussion by Representative Conta, who discusses that rules and regulations control prescribed wildfires and how this provides many key benefits. And this may be true, but understand that it still happens. There's been numerous occasions of prescribed burns that turn into wildfires and cause innumerable harm, including the example in Paradise, California, in which 14,000 deaths were caused by a prescribed burn that turned bad. But aside from this, we must also discuss the side harms that have nothing to do with their correct implementation. The Connect Institute goes on to state that when hillsides are stripped bare from their vegetation, it creates the potential for a mudslide or landslide to occur. After the forest fire goes out, precipitation can cause ash and soil, the event to begin washing downward. In 2017, Santa Barbara County experienced such an event where a prescribed fire caused waist-high mud to come down 35 miles per hour, killing at least 17 people in its wake. Rushing water also picks up debris, rocks, and even vehicles on its way down, creating more damage. This is a key net harm in this debate. Next, I'd like to discuss what Senator Elakwa touched on in his speech, but I'd like to elaborate, discussing health, specifically public health. And the Public Health Advocacy Group goes on to state that wildfires are an unpredictable component of PM 2.5 pollution in states like California or other ones that are contributed to with wildfires, contributing as low as 17,068 tons in 2005 and 53,480 tons in 2011, to as high as 529,821 tons in 2008. The importance of this is the fact that when you utilize prescribed burns, you increase this number dramatically, especially when the state of air quality is already incredibly poor. And this has a dramatic result on public health. Children, elderly individuals, and pregnant women have higher risks of smoke-related respiratory illnesses and morbidities than when you don't use prescribed burns. That also increases cardiac problems to most susceptible, strokes, and death due to fire's toxic smoke. But finally, I'd like to look at the most important argument in this round, because the arguments in the negation by Representative Conta and those who will likely go in the future rely on the idea that prescribed burning actually is beneficial to preventing wildfires. And I'd like to prove this wrong with a far-reaching study of every significant wildfire from the 1980s, since the 1980s. The International Journal of Wildfires finds that 95% of fires that destroyed property occurred on days when fire danger was already very high. Prescribed fire impacts and the behavior and effects of large wildfires are incredibly minimal. The actual cause is extreme weather conditions, something this legislation hoped to minimize. Understand, this negates these arguments and why you must
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 15 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Senator Gupta.
Hi, Representative. Are more people affected by controlled fires or wildfires right now?
Obviously wildfires, but controlled fires add to the problem, especially when it's at its worst.
Right, but inherently the entire purpose of a controlled fire is to manage said wildfire. Isn't there at the very least some net benefit if you're able to manage it?
I actually stated in my speech that in 95% of cases of wildfires, the direct cause was climate. There's absolutely nothing
that climate is caused by wildfires.
And my quotation went on to state that it did little to minimize it, whether they were prescribed burns or not.
Hi, let's talk about your example of California where 14,000 people lost their lives. Was that a prescribed fire or was that a campfire that got out of control?
I'm sure you'll tell me.
It was a campfire. And was it 14,000 people that lost their lives or was it that 14,000 homes that were affected?
I'm sure you'll tell me.
It was homes that were affected, not people that lost their lives. So how can we take that as like a relevant example of the dangers of prescribed fire if A, that damage was overblown, and B, that wasn't even a prescribed
even if
fire
you don't take that example, I cited many others in my speech of other huge net harms.
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, we're now in line for a speech in the negation. Any and all negative speakers, please rise. Between those standing, that will go to Senator Wu off of recency.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Wu speaking for the second time this session. Judges, once again, it starts with a J, not a Z. Please don't confuse that because I know that it can be. I will take silence as an indication that you guys are ready, and I can begin. The United States is sitting in a burning room, literally. But while the affirmative argues that today's legislation is the fire extinguisher, it's clear that they've actually misread the label. It's clearly kerosene. You failed today's legislation because it's what experts back alongside science. First, let's understand what experts think about prescribed fires. The National Park Service itself explains that prescribed fires can be the most cost-effective way to maintain certain historic scenes alongside other forests. Senator Alakwa, let's make this clear. Firefighter budgets have been slashed, and the only way to actually confront these wildfires is through prescribed fires. Let me fill the details in. The RAND Corporation on November 6th, 2020 explains the current problem with wildfire management. It's saying that our wildfire management and response system is burdened by labor system inefficiencies. In layman's terms, wildland firefighters are seasonal workers that lose their jobs in the winter. This workforce churn results in costly training of new firefighters every single year, but the ranks of the expert workforce disappear. But let's also understand the science behind this. Senator Conta dropped the ball on this, but let me make this brutally clear. The Southern Fire Exchange in 2017 explains that conducting one prescribed fire every 2 years cut total fires by 40% and total acres of forest burnt by over 75%. Senator Conta talked about how prescribed fires have benefits. I want to make this clear. We turn every single problem that Senator Alakwa and Senator Lawrence talked about. The air quality degrades, but when you make sure that the total fires that exist, alongside the total acres burned, decrease by such a significant amount, the impact and magnitude of a prescribed fire saving lives is significantly larger. But then we talk about the danger of prescribed fires. The Forest Service study from August of 2013 explains that over 99% of prescribed fires are successfully held within planned perimeters. That means that the majority of your planned fires are actually safe. Let's make this clear. We currently face a budget crisis and firefighters can't be paid. The only way that we solve this problem is continuing with the status quo, which is prescribed fires. Every single affirmative impact that you hear is actually a negation impact because prescribed fires decrease the total amount of damage by such a significant amount. It's clear that the affirmative has clearly misread today's legislation. Don't actually douse the kerosene on the fire. Negate.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 1 second. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Between those standing, that first goes to Senator Conda.
Can we predict wildfires in the status quo, like to a relative accuracy?
No.
We actually can, because the same experts that you talk about have been able to map different regions and like classify different days as high probability wildfire days. So why not, instead of using prescribed fires, we just tell citizens when the fires are going to be?
Okay, I would still contend that prescribed fires are safer because we prevent their homes from burning down.
Right, except with prescribed fire, there's always the risk of just like, the fires getting out of control when they wouldn't have with
1%
nature.
chance compared to the 99.
Senator Ilakwa.
Right, but
Okay, let's talk about the 1% of chances when a fire gets out of control. In that case, who's liable for the damages that could be caused for that fire?
I'm sure you can tell me.
It's the government who set the fire in the first place, meaning that then we have to pay damages to our citizens. In that case, is it not better to let nature take its course as opposed to have to pay back these people and cut down our firefighting budget?
I would contend it's a better cost-saving measure that we don't do that, because we won't need to pay to rebuild these communities and pay to make sure that people are okay. I value human lives over this entire argument of money.
Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation, we're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Senator Rao, unopposed.
I thank the chair. That's Rao, spelled R-A-O, for the second time in this legislative session. Same on my placard, same on my screen. I know that my PO is always ready, and unless my judges aren't ready, I'll begin in just a moment. Of all the Aristotle elements, fire is the most dangerous, because fire is alive and can burn anything in its path. Don't play with fire when there are real lives at stake. Affirm. Representatives on the negation seem to misunderstand what actually happens when it comes to wildfires and prescribed burns. The chief scientist of the Geos Institute in Ashland, Oregon, in September 27, 2017, says that the goal of prescribed fires is often to prevent large blazes. Yes, I agree. But this ignores the correlation between climate and large fires. Low-severity fires do not emulate nor are responsible for large blazes, which are primarily climate and weather-driven events. Prescribed burning does not change the weather. Simply put, no matter how much we burn forests, wildfires will still happen. This point is non-unique. Regardless of what the negation tells you, the occasional increased intensity of wildfires is less harmful than the rampant use of controlled fires by professionals. In the end, wildfires will happen whether or not we pass, but what does change is the health and safety of our constituents. Now, I don't disagree that prescribed fires can be used to decrease wildfires, but the risks outweigh the benefits. Now, Senator Contemnani, when I questioned you about the personnel when it comes to prescribed fires, I just want to clarify a few issues with your perspective. With prescribed fires, to keep them controlled, you need a lot of firefighters and a lot of other regulators on site. And guess what this does? Exposes countless Americans to pollutants, often actual burns, and sometimes even death. The Medical Journal of Australia on April 20th, 2020 tells us that during 2002-2007, particulate air pollution exceeded their national standard on 300 days. Of those days, 75% of this pollution was attributed to prescribed burns. Inhaling this pollution is dangerous for human health and can cause short and long-term respiratory problems, which can potentially be fatal. We can stop the burning of the lungs of millions when you pass. To quantify this in money, the University of Tasmania in April 2020 tells us that the estimated smoke-related costs of wildfires were $25 million annually. Total estimated health costs were $190 million. $97 million of this was attributed to prescribed burns, while $77 million of this was attributed to wildfires. This isn't just a difference in $20 million worth of medical bills for prescribed fires. It's a difference between life and death. To quantify this in human lives, there were an estimated 41 premature deaths, 99 hospitalizations for cardiovascular problems, and 175 for respiratory conditions. When we talk about wildfires, every congressperson in this chamber wants to decrease them. Senator Jay Wu, when you bring up prescribed fires, you mentioned that they're the most cost effective. And often when we weigh the options, people choose prescribed fires because of this reason. But by passing today, what we do is value safety over costs. We can switch to methods like thinning, which is just as effective and safer. We save lives.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 15 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Between those standing, the first question will go to Senator Wu.
Hi, Senator Rao. So let's talk about the wildfires. With prescribed burnings in the area compared to no prescribed burnings, the magnitude of the wildfires is the same, according to you?
No, I'm saying it can decrease, but instead of prescribed fires, we can choose options that are much, much safer for constituents. Like
Okay, so is that actually financially viable for these governments?
No, but I'm saying that we have the power to give them that funding, and also we should value lives over money every single day.
Does today's legislation give any money?
No, but we can do that in the future.
Senator Zhang.
Hi, Senator. Going off of that previous line of questioning, why do we have to use different alternatives instead of passing the bill that's on our table today? What's significantly more harmful?
I'm on the affirmation representative.
Sorry, why do we have to use different alternatives rather than...
So what we do with this legislation is prevent people from going first to this cost-effective option and tell us that we need to value lives over money every single time.
Right, but what's so more significantly harmful about prescribed fires?
Like I said, all the health problems that come from it. People die.
We also reduce the health problems that come from wild.
Thank you. Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech in the affirmation, we're now in line for a speech in the negation. Any and all negative speakers, please rise. Between those standing, that speech will fall to Senator Resnick off of recency.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. That's Senator Resnick again. I can't see anybody, so if my pew could let me know when everyone's ready.
Okay. I don't think anybody's not ready, so I think you're good to go.
Okay, trust you. 4 million acres, 112 million tons of greenhouse gas, 11 million gallons of fire retardant, and 31 lives lost. The California wildfires weren't just a talking point for NBC. They were a tragedy. And it's easy to hear these numbers and want some immediate change, but when the change we're presented today merely fuels the fire, I ask you not to fall for the inanimate numerics that have obscured this debate. Allow me to part the clouds of confusion with one simple question. Are prescribed fires productive? I've got a couple of reasons here. Number one, first introduced by Senator Conta, these types of fires are inherently preventative. They clear out the chemical fuels that build up within a forest fire, stopping an organic fire from metastasizing and starting in the first place. They also clear out the undergrowth that exists in a fire that is inherently flammable material that, again, causes fires to start, and allows them to become bigger. And at the very least, at the affirmation's highest ground, the Department of Interior notes that many species of native plant need the recurrence of fire in order to reproduce, explaining that their seeds are encased for protection from predators and they need a fire in order to break them open. So in this situation in which a disaster occurs, which I'd like to note exists in either world, only the negation can utilize a regulated fire to ensure the reconstruction of a forest. All that being considered, I'd like to take the time to entertain the idea that they are not productive. Again, holding the affirmation at its highest ground. First and foremost, let's respond to this claim that we can just develop a better response mechanism, just fronted by Senator Rao. Very clearly, prescribed fires are not mutually exclusive to other things. You can employ both prescribed fire and other reduction methods to accomplish the best results. That's simply not a reason to pass that's exclusive to their side. Even further, all of the development that we're talking about, it takes time. So you have to ask yourself, what happens in between that gap? I'll tell you, all of the new money that we free up from a prescribed fire only goes back into the budget, goes towards fire retardants to compensate for the loss in prevention. Why is that problematic? Well, the Columbia Environmental Research Service explained September of 2020 that ammonium phosphate, a fast-paced fertilizer, is the most common ingredient found in fire retardants, making up 20%. Again, why is that problematic? Well, as the U.S. forest industry explains, in California, where there's massive wildfires, they found after the California wildfires and the use of fire retardant an abundant overgrowth of invasive plant species following the wildfires. However, when the dry season came around in California, the non-native plants died off, creating layers of dry bush that actively present as fuel for fires in the future. The comparative here is simple. Even if a prescribed fire is entirely ineffective, an alternative that worsens our crisis is simply not a better world. The negation still wins on this point. I gave you a bunch of numbers. All I ask in return is your negation ballot.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Between those standing, that first question will fall to Senator Wu.
Hi, Senator Resnick. Let's talk about your not mutually exclusive point. Can you explain how thinning works?
I believe that we just set a fire aflame and it tends to thin out, especially in these.
No, thinning is when you take a bunch of the flammable material and you get rid of it from the area. Now, what happens when we burn flammable material? It disappears, right?
It goes away.
Yeah, exactly. So how is thinning and causing a fire going to both?
If your only alternative can also be accomplished by prescribed fire, then it's not a reason to pass again.
Senator Ilakwa.
Okay, bouncing off that line of questioning, why is it better to burn biomass than just take the biomass out of the area and thin the forest?
Yeah. Like I explained in the beginning of my speech, there's an inherent necessity for some types of trees to be burnt so that we allow the extreme types of fuel that build up naturally in a forest to kind of get released.
But we can just remove that fuel by thinning the forest and turn not producing the pollutants that we see with prescribed burning, correct?
Fuel is not a liquid, right? It builds up in the core of the food. You have to.
The biomass
Thank you.
is still a fuel.
Questioning time has elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as I was a speech in the negation, and we're now in line for a speech in the affirmation, any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. I'm going to go ahead and call one more time. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Okay. Seeing no aff speeches, the chair highly, highly frowns upon a one-sided debate. We had this problem again on the first bill, so I'd encourage someone to flip. But we're going to move back to the negation. Any negative speakers? Senator Conda unopposed.
I thank the chair. This is Senator Conda, likely speaking for the last time today. Hopefully I can add some fuego to this round and enlighten us. If you guys don't know Spanish, that means fire. Don't want to create any misunderstandings. All right, cringy jokes aside, if you guys are not ready, let me know, or else I'll be happy to start. Okay, I don't hear any indication, so I'll just go ahead and start. And just to make sure this is the negation, right? Okay. The affirmation advocates for burning down the system, but just take a moment and consider who's being left behind in the flames. Burn this legislation to douse the fire in this country. But first, let's get into the specifics. The whole negation, my side, is hyper-focused on wildfires, but they literally ignore probably their biggest impact, agricultural food supplies. UC Davis study explains that understand that one of the largest problems for farmers in the status quo is invasive species in their crops which destroy farms. In fact, the large majority of all prescribed fires in the status quo are for agricultural purposes. It should be the biggest point of debate, but nobody's even brought it up. So then question arises, how do farmers actually get rid of invasive species in the status quo? The National Wildlife Refuge System explains that they currently use herbicides that weed out invasive species, but also destroy the environment by A, contaminating native crops, and B, degrading soil quality. But finally, we're seeing a shift away from that paradigm. Penn State University in October 1st of 2020 explains that prescribed fires are becoming more and more common on agricultural land for killing invasive species because they don't harm native species and keep soils safe for planting. The amount of farmers using controlled burns is increasing and thus also increasing innovations that are happening, making fires safer. Representative Alakwa, the problems you state are only prevalent in the short term. When you pass, that shift towards these burn fires slows down. Your decision to pass this legislation cuts profits for American agriculture while destroying the land we live on. That outweighs the affirmation's impact of smoke. Representative Alakwa and the affirmation concede that wildfires will happen by nature or by controlled fire. The smoke created is thus non-unique. Herbicide use only happens in the affirmation use, so the negation overall wins the climate argument. But second, let's get more into specifics. Agricultural destruction is not just a broad harm for all people in this country, but it destroys some of the most vulnerable groups as well. That's why, second, you fail to preserve land for indigenous tribes. Currently, prescribed burning is an important physical and cultural aspect of many indigenous and Native American tribes in the US. NPR in August 2020 explains that invasive species, lack of soil nutrition, and harmful animal species are the issues that perpetuate agricultural problems on Native American reservations. Guess how they're solved? Prescribed fires. They haven't been doing it for the past 10 or 20 years. They've been doing it for hundreds of years and made it extremely effective. There's actually no harm of Native Americans using prescribed fires. But passing today's legislation not only hurts their already underfunded reservations, but negatively impacts their culture. We increase the suffering of Native people. That alone wins and outweighs whatever semantic and marginal impacts the AF and the neg have brought up thus far. We increase Native suffering. Let's consider for a moment the human cost of suffering. It looks like cold winters without heat, hungry summers without food, and a constant vilification of humanity and dignity. Indigenous people have had to escape 1,000 memories until they put enough time and distance between them and their misery to finally wake up to a better day. Respect that and fail.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 11 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise.
Before we get to the question, could you guys hear me okay? Because some of the screens are kind of blacked out. So was there any lag?
You were okay. I didn't have to stop the time at all, and we can hear you fine right now.
Okay, thank you.
First question, Senator Alakwa.
Okay, are farms dependent on fires to survive as an ecosystem? Because that's what this legislation specifically defines prescribed burns as.
Yes, they are.
Okay, how is that so? Like, require burning? Like, have we
farms have to? Okay, maintaining the ecosystem means pushing out invasive crops, correct?
Sure, but don't we have other solutions to do that?
So pushing out the invasive crops, okay, I tell you, yeah, they have methods to do it in the status quo. The problem is that they're very harmful to the environment.
Thank you. We have one more block of questioning. Would anybody like to fill that? Senator Alakwa, would you like to continue that line? Okay. Seeing no questioners, the chair will absorb the remaining 30 seconds of questioning time. Speaker may return to mute.
I think the chair. I'm going to really quickly refresh so I can see everybody again.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, seeing as that was a speech in the negation, I'm going to go back to the affirmative. Any and all affirmative speakers, please rise. Okay. One more time, just in case. Any AF speakers? Seeing none, Chair frowns upon a one-sided debate, but it must go on, so we'll go back to the negation again. Are there any negative speakers? Senator Gupta off of recency.
I think the chair. Pio, can you see and hear me? Because everything's kind of black for me as well right now.
We can see you okay, and I think we can hear you okay. But
Just
there's
1 second, I'm going to jump in here. So this is going to be the third negative speech in a row, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so we do, if there's not an affirmative speaker after this, have to move to the previous question. Is there a point of inquiry?
Point of order, actually.
Point of order.
The Yale tournament doesn't actually require that.
Okay.
It's partly discretion, then we can do that.
Okay, no, that's why I'm asking. That's why I wanted to.
Yeah, the tournament rules have no limit on the amount of cycles that on the same side. But that being said, this will be the third neg in a row. Okay, cool. Back to you, Senator Gupta. We can see you right now, and I think we can hear you. Judges, if you can't, please let me know.
Awesome. So once again, that's Representative Gupta, spelled Gupta, and I'm going to assume my judges are ready unless told otherwise. Okay. This debate has gotten pretty convoluted, so let's clear things up with a quick game of true or false. Representative Vilacqua started out today's debate by introducing this idea that you hurt the ecosystem. False, because NPR in August of 2021 explains that in the Southwest, the Forest Service manages fires for one reason: benefiting the ecosystem. That's because you help certain trees and plants thrive by clearing new space for native growth, recycling soil nutrients, and spreading seeds from species and pine cones that have adapted to fire in especially prone areas. But let's just say this is a battle of my source versus Senator Vilacqua's. Why does the negation actually win here? I asked Senator Vilacqua about historical precedent, and he said that controlling fires didn't work in the past. That's false. Slate in August of 2021 looks at the 1960s, when the Forest Service actually banned controlled fires, just like this bill wants to do. Federal departments who were tasked with land oversight noticed two main things. Number one, fire department sequoia trees were in decline. So Representative Vilacqua, you don't actually help the ecosystem, because while in your world you may help some of it, it's at the risk of even more. The second thing that they noticed is that the acreage affected by wildfires was increasing, and thus the Forest Service started keeping regular track of areas left scorched at the beginning of the decade, meaning that quite literally, historically, when we stopped controlling fires, more land was affected by wildfires, and thus more land was affected by the associated impact. So Representative Lawrence, more acreage is affected by wildfires, disproving your entire point. And Representative Rao, it's more cost effective for less land to be burned. And on magnitude, the effect to individual citizens who are affected by unpredictable fires is considerably greater than controlled ones, because controlled ones can be planned and anticipated for. Uncontrolled ones cannot be prepared for, and individual citizens are the ones that you put at risk while we sit here debating dollar bills. But the affirmation continues to insist that you hurt more people with prescription. False. Ignore the rhetoric for the reality. In 2017, 50,000 areas in California were affected by controlled fires. That sounds like a lot, but it's 30 times less than the 1.5 million acres affected by uncontrolled fires in the same year, according to the California Department of Forestry. There's actually a comparison right now in the status quo. NPR in 2021 says that right now, about a month ago, the Forest Service actually put a stop on controlled fires temporarily. 2021 has also been the worst year in fire history in my home state of California and is building up to be one of the worst ones in the nation. Representative Lawrence, you said that prescribed fires have a risk of getting out of control. That's only 0.5% according to the article, proving you false once again. The only true thing today should be your vote for a negation ballot.
Thank you for that speech of 3 minutes and 3 seconds. We're now in line for 1 minute of direct questioning. Any and all questioners, please rise. Between those standing, that will first go to Senator Lawrence.
So you say that for California, this year has been the worst in history, right?
Yeah.
So is it likely that it's going to get worse in the future?
Yeah, because right now there's a temporary stop on controlled fires.
And since you said yourself 0.5% of prescribed burns get out of hand, shouldn't we be doing whatever we can to suppress this risk as fire gets worse in the future?
We're looking at 0.5% being the risk versus 99.95 being the risk. Like, we win on probability because
How many prescribed burns are done every year?
50,000,
right?
There were 50,000 acres affected, but there were 1.5 million affected by uncontrolled.
Senator Wu.
Hi, Senator. Let's play the game of true or false again. True or false, climate change affects wildfires?
True.
Okay, true or false, it increases the number and magnitude?
False.
Okay, so climate change doesn't increase the number of wildfires?
Sure, but controlled fires aren't the leading cause in that.
Okay, I'm asking about climate change because you're
Okay, sure, true.
Okay, so essentially what we're talking about is climate change being why wildfires exist in the first place, correct?
Yes, but the way that they would
Okay,
be managed is through
so
controlled
prescribed
fires.
fires don't actually have an impact on
Thank you.
the...
No, they
Questioning time
manage
has
them.
elapsed. Speaker may return to mute. Seeing as that was a speech in the negation, we're now in line for a speech in the affirmation. Senator Zhang, is that a motion?
Yeah, I motion for a 10-minute recess. I'm trying to flip to the affirmation right now, but if we take like a quick break, then I should be able to. Otherwise, I just have to give the fourth negation speech in a row, which I don't think anybody wants to hear. So if we have time, would that be possible?
We do have time, but does that motion have a second, first of all? Is that seconded, Senator Konda? Okay, cool.
Do you need
there
10
any
minutes? Is 10 minutes? Or can you do it in 5?
I would rather have it 10 minutes because if it was in 5, I would just not be able to get anything done.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Are there any objections to that motion? Okay, seeing none, we will have a 10-minute recess. For the chamber's reference, this session is supposed to stop at noon Central. So we do have time for that 10-minute recess. And then once we get back, Senator Zhang will give his speech, and then everybody will have 2 for the chamber's reference.
Just a quick question for I guess the PO and the rest of the chamber. So since if we go to if we take a 10-minute recess and Representative Zhang gives his speech, we'll be at 11:50. Can we just end around 10 minutes earlier?
Yes.
So that,
cycles. Yeah.
The priority for this tournament is just giving everybody the same opportunity to speak. Once Senator Zhang gives that second speech, everybody in this round will have 2. So it is okay to adjourn 10 minutes early. As long as the parlor is okay with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's in line with what Tab said as well.